Hi, good morning. My name is John. My first time participating, and we're looking at what anchor institution implementation could look like for the county, and so looking specifically at the food procurement and, career pipeline opportunities.
My name is Megan Worley. I work with Food Service Partners. I have been either participated in or listened in on several different ARC conversations, and kind of on the other side of this, so I'm just here to hear the full public learning section, have some updates on that, and yeah.
Thank you. I know you just stepped in and said, well, actually, I wanted it. Totally cool. You sit down. Okay. So why don't we pass it on to Sabrina?
Hi, I'm Sabrina Wu. I'm at the Foundation, and involved in and out of the art process, and looking forward to hearing updates.
Hi, I'm Alexa Delwich. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Good Food Purchasing, and I participated, I believe, in a meeting maybe 2 years ago, and then have stayed in conversation with Lucia and Tara, and I'm eager to see where there may be opportunities to collaborate as I hear where you're headed.
Hi everyone, I'm Danielle. I'm an associate at PolicyLink, and I've heard about ARC a little bit before, and this is my first time participating in a meeting. And similarly, I'm working on a procurement project at PolicyLink, and I'm interested to see where there's opportunities to continue learning together.
Hi, good morning. I'm Alex Bezatel. I'm a program manager here at the California Endowment in our Oakland office. And I am interested in getting an update, and also I was really excited to see the report that Democracy Collaborative released yesterday around land use and the relationship between anchors and kind of land use and for public good, and thinking about if there's any space for that, how that intersects with this aspect of the anchor strategy, which is also about wealth building, but in a slightly different vein. So.
Good morning. I'm Marissa Raya with the City of Oakland Economic and Workforce Development Department. I manage the city's economic development strategy, and I'm on the business development team. Myself or one of my colleagues participated in several ARC meetings when the project was first starting and met with the Democracy Collaborative and Tara, and as the project started to crystallize around the pilot in Richmond, we maybe pulled back a little bit, but we're here and ready to do the work in Oakland.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kennan, and I work for an urban farm called Big Beach, which is in San Leandro. It's about 10 acres. It's funded by the Alameda Sheriff's Department, so I'm kind of the voice of reason for them. And I'm here to learn more and see how the farm can we collaborate.
What's your other?
Oh, and I also own a restaurant in this is called Bizarre. Oh, yeah, it's One Market. Yeah.
Very humble.
Good morning. I'm Denise Fairchild, National Director for Oakland City Collaborative, and very excited about art and where it's grown, and more importantly, I'm looking for ways to transform the regional food system and partnership growth.
Good morning, I'm Kelly Martin. I am the Director of Community Benefit Operations here for the I support the local community benefit managers throughout the city. Good morning, I'm Gina Willows, colleague at Presidente, and involved with art here every day. And really kind of learn to get caught up in where we are and the opportunity. I think people know that they're increasingly exploring how we can use our assets beyond those benefits to really intentionally anchor institutions into the health community where we're located. So this is great. Hi, I'm Leslie Nicholson with Preventing Institute, and she's hosted many art meetings, but I'm not ready to attend. So I'm really happy to be here, and my own background is actually with food bank nutrition, and before I was working on prevention, so I'm really interested in, and food work's been going on in the U.S. for a long time, and trying to see cost drivers. I'm very interested in those practices that are here, and how we can perhaps really start to push to scale across our
Good morning, everyone. I'm Lucia Fair. I work with Healthcare Without Harm. I'm the Western Regional Director for the Healthy Food and Healthcare Program at Healthcare Without Harm. And we co-coordinate the ARC development with Pendleton. Well, we're all, I think, very excited to present the work that has been happening here over the past year and a half, our evaluation, our governance work, and also just really excited now to re-engage, kind of invite the community partners sort of back in where we can all start working together on this. So very excited about that.
My name is Lauren Moore, and I also work with Lucia at Healthcare Without Harm, and I've been working with Emerald City Collaborative over the last 2 years to do various behind-the-scenes things with ARC, including evaluations. We'll be talking about that today, and I'm just really excited to see all your faces and see the new faces and just engage and connect around what ARC can be and sort of what matters to all the people in the room. So excited to be here.
Awesome, and there's clearly some folks that have walked in, and we have 2 more people coming in, so let's try and grab everyone. So the question for those of you who have just come in is your name, your organization, and what would you like to get out of this gathering today?
My name is Sarah Kuda. I'm the Program and Policy Manager at Mandela Marketplace. Broadly, we work on issues related to food access and economic development. We also help launch locally owned food enterprises, one of which is Mandela Food Distribution, which sources sustainably grown produce from marginalized African farmers in the Salish Valley. So we're excited to learn how we can collaborate with ARC to build out the produce distribution for these farmers.
Hi, good morning. I'm Nehanda Imara. I'm with the Center for Community. I've been with it since pre-planning to present, and I understand about sustainability and
Okay, so we'll go to you three. If you have your questions, but then your name, who, your organization, and what are you hoping to get out of this conversation? Okay.
My name is Elise Rainey. I've kind of worked for a number of justice and farm organizations. Today is just to learn and really new, so this is my first time interacting with her. I'm having to
Hi, good morning, everyone. Melen Searam with San Mateo County Health System. I focus on housing and economic development, and so my interest today is around workforce development.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Gavin Raiders with Planting Justice. We're a food and economic justice organization in Oakland, and I'm here to build community, build relationships, and see what we can do together.
Awesome. So I'm not really, so as you'll see, I put a list of all the names of people who are anticipating coming. There are some new folks here, that's so that you guys have a reference, and some people aren't able to come today. We are having another presentation in Richmond in September because there's two very active cities and a lot of different stakeholders. We really want to make sure that as many people are engaged in this conversation.
Announcement, which I haven't done before. We are going to record our presentation, and so the first, as you will see, for the first, hour. Oh, look at our timing. Look at that. Okay, we're ahead. Okay, cool, nice. Our presentation is really going to be at you for the first hour because there's so much information that we have to share. And Caitlin did some amazing research that will be very useful moving the regional food system project forward. But for many of you, ARC, what we really want you to know, and the ARC is a much bigger conversation. And so you guys all were able to pick up the Democracy Collaborative Summary Report. That gives you a context also to read. It's a distilled version of a 27-page document, which I think you would never probably choose to read on your own. So here's the 4-page document. And we were going to give you a context of, all that's happened because we are in what we call phase 3. Okay, so now, recording, we are going to present, and then when you guys ask questions, there are areas for questions. You're going to push, probably when we do the Q&A, we'll have all of you push on this, and it goes green, and then that allows, when we have Q&A, for you guys to speak, and that will help us record the questions. We are hopeful this will work, but as many of you know about technology, it doesn't necessarily mean it will be smooth or accurate, so we're putting that in the faith of, the great mystery that it will all work out. And now I have to actually start the recording, so who's helping me with that? Oh, shoot. You mean I'm recording now? Okay. Gosh. Okay. That was unfair. Okay. So we're calling this the ReBoot, and it's primarily because the last year and a half we have been working on building the infrastructure to actually invite you, which our goal is to invite you into holding ARC. What is ARC? So you guys have probably, for those of you who have participated, you've seen this slide probably a zillion times because this is kind of like that key slide, but it's important to introduce it again. What is ARC? It's a table of representatives from key anchor institutions in the healthcare and educational sectors, nonprofit organizations, lenders, foundations, community leaders in cities and counties in the Bay Area. Healthcare Without Harm in Emerald Cities convene the table, and our mission is to address the social, both economic, environmental determinants of health by leveraging the assets and capacities of the Bay Area anchor institutions and community-based partners with a focus on expanding community wealth and ownership, improving health outcomes, and strengthening the capacities of communities of color and low and moderate income residents to be resilient in the face of climate and economic disruption, which we know is happening really at a dire level, especially in the economics and climate as well here in the Bay Area and elsewhere. So in general, we've had we're on phase 3. We've had our first phase, which many of you guys have participated, which we did, research, interviewing over 250 stakeholders, getting a context of what supply was available. And for supply, it's like, what are the businesses? What's really juicy within the communities? Where do they want movement to take place? And then the demand, the procurement. What are the anchors not getting? What are they not unable to facilitate, and how can they actually arrive at some of the community benefits and outcomes that ARC needed? We'll go a little bit into a description of what came out of the Democracy Collaborative Assessment, but then the past year and a half, we have been working on setting up evaluation and governance and actually doing research on the food system. And workforce around the food system. And the project around food system was an opportunity that came up with a Kaiser contractor. But we really need the groundwork, the support in order to make it work. And that's what we've been spending the last 14 months, working with consultants, working with working groups to actually define how are we going to measure this? How are we going to keep it accountable? How are we going to have it actually be held by community and different stakeholders, so they're leading it, because healthcare without harm in Emerald Cities can't hold this. It's a very big project. And then we had Caitlin who come in to actually do research, to really get a context of what's here in the East Bay and larger within the area for farmers, food procurers, aggregators, and also to look at workforce and labor and the process and where are the opportunities that ARC can step in and actually make a difference. And here we are at phase 3, and that is to bring you in to ReBoot and have you participate. And we'll show you a little bit about what we think that governance structure looks like. For those of you who are here 2 years ago, we talked about that, but now we actually have a framework that we can then set people in place to actually deliver on. Richmond and East Oakland, these two communities were specifically targeted because one of our partners, the Cal Endowment, has an initiative, which I think most of you know about, the Building Healthy Communities Initiative, where they invested $1 billion for 14 communities. And how can, within the East Bay, these two communities benefit from economic development? So we have been working with Richmond and East Oakland stakeholders in the hopes that when we do choose a business, that we locate it in those communities so that the economics actually benefit the stakeholders there. And I just throw this question out to the Cal Endowment right now. Are you guys continuing, because I know it ends 2020, is there a further extension of building healthy communities in terms of work? Okay, we don't have to answer that. Yeah. To be determined? Okay, okay. Okay. So the exciting part is that within several of the initiatives that have come up, these two sites are really ripe to hold them. And it doesn't preclude other parts and other counties, because of course what we're looking at is ecosystem development. A business is set there, but it actually, ARC's work is to look at the ecosystem and support it through numerous ways of financing, small business, or the supporting organizations and businesses. So here's the report. You guys have it. We did a summary through Vital Research. They helped us to reframe it so that it's readable, easily accessible to read. And within it, you'll see that we were able to look at the assets and challenges, the aggregated procurement demand, which is within our study was $6.8 billion. And that wasn't all the procurement. Those were within the specific specific anchors that we addressed, but it wasn't all the anchors. So there's certainly more than that. We had priority areas and then key factors of success. The priority areas were healthy food, clean energy, green building construction, and green enterprises. And so this is really where we really are excited about having that steering committee and then people holding it to find out what the future projects will be and what makes sense. Again, we wanted to set the framework for it to actually be deliverable, but there are some really exciting things, and I think there are some of these ready to go soon And then the Democracy Collaborative gave us 10 key factors of success. And I think we've got a lot of them in place. We have a project champion, multi-anchor institution support, viable business opportunities using anchor demand, business development resources and industry experience, available financing, political and community concurrence, workforce development capacity, wraparound services, a community loan fund incubator, and complementary strategies or programs. So this is kind of what we want to make sure we're holding when we're in the work groups and the steering committee to address, are these things here and how do we build those? So right now we're actually going to give you what we have considered the governance, the holding, the framing of ARC. And I want to invite my colleague, Lauren Orr from Healthcare Without Harm, who is instrumental in the evaluation work, to share with you.
Thank you, Tara. Sure, thanks. So like Tara said, phase one, I came on right when phase one had finished, and so, you know, the areas were articulated, the priority areas where there was a lot of opportunity for engagement and progress. And then that was at the same time that ARC was presented with the Regional Food Systems Project, and that was really supposed to be the time to really articulate the governance and the structure and start to set some evaluation framework in place. So we decided, after a year of kind of just holding the Regional Food System Project, seeing what it was, listening, hearing from others, to embark on an evaluation process to really get that first phase baseline understanding of what was happening with our stakeholders. And we really wanted to hear how are people experiencing ARC, and we really wanted to clarify how people were able to engage with ARC. So we put together last spring an evaluation work group. We pulled from the advisory committee, and we got mostly interest from anchors. I don't know if it's like the title, evaluation work group. Maybe we could have spiced it up a little, but it was Kaiser and UCSF were the folks that were like, we want to participate. So we could work on that in the future. But they had a lot of expertise in evaluation, so it was great to have them. And they really advised us to get an external consultant rather than trying to do it from within. They helped us put together the request for proposals to find vital research, and they also helped us select vital research to do the evaluation for us. They also helped us articulate what we needed to do with this consultant. And so I'm going to talk to you about three components of that evaluation. We started by developing our logic model. We had sort of a bare bones model, but we worked with a consultant to really take all of the things that ARC is doing and put them into a model that articulated our activities to our vision, how we're getting there. Also, we did a ARC participation and collaboration survey, which some of you probably participated in, to really hear from our stakeholders, how is it to participate in ARC, and how has the collaboration process been for you? So we'll talk about some of those results. We also worked with the consultant to do the My Cultivar Richmond Food Production Center indicator list and dashboard to measure the success of the My Cultivar project based on ARC's values and engagement. So I'm not going to dive into that as deeply because it's sort of off topic, but we do have a whole indicator list, and we've been working with our partners at Food Service Partners, Megan in the back, to make that work with them and work for our interest as well. And so I'll talk about how we're incorporating the recommendations we heard from the evaluation in 2018 as well. So we started with the logic model, and everyone's probably familiar with logic models, but it's really just an articulation of a collaborative or an organization's vision. And it was really important for us to connect and articulate the activities that we do as the ARC co-conveners, and then how collectively with our other stakeholders we get to our vision of community wealth, community health, and climate resilience. And that happens through the market and institutional transformation. So as you can see here, this is a summary of a larger model that has, 5 pages or something that really takes you through the community wealth outcomes, and the community health outcomes, and then the climate resilience outcomes, which, as we all know, yeah? Which, as we all know, is really hard to measure. So this is really something that is an aspirational vision type of thing. And thank you, Caitlin. So, yeah, so again, you have this, we sent this in advance, but we really talked about this as a living logic model because it's already been changing as we've had more meetings with different stakeholders, and they've said, you know, that doesn't really resonate with me, or, you know, how is hiring and purchasing of anchors articulated in this model? So it's growing, and if you guys have feedback, you know, we're going to have a Q&A time, so if you see something in here that doesn't make sense or doesn't really resonate with you, we'd love to hear from you because it's been changing. And we also are using it to help vet future projects that come along, because when the Regional Food System Project came along, we didn't really have a structure for how are we going to vet this and what are we going to put it against to know that it's a project that we can support and get behind. So having some of these outcomes articulated helps us look at a project and they can say, this is how we're going to reach these outcomes. Yes?
So what is one of your visions on each of those domains, just so that we get a sense of this end game, what we're
Do you want me to read the outcomes? Yeah. Top line it? Okay, I'll just read through 10 to 20 years. So for community wealth, decreased poverty rate, income inequality, and unemployment rate, increased job retention, increased wealth retention in the community. Big goals. And then for community health, decreased chronic disease rates and increased well-being for people experiencing health inequities. For climate resilience, creation of decentralized, community-owned regional networks for critical community needs like food, energy, and water. And then for marketed institutional transformation, anchors become system integrators, and regions across the United States adopt the ARC model for anchor community partnership for health, wealth, and resilience. And that's actually connected to scaling the model to that activity. So it's a big vision. And do you want to say more about the vision? 'Cause it is powerful. And I feel like Denise is like the big vision person, so if you want to hop up here. Let's just do it, right? Ready to do it. So, yeah, so to get to that vision, let's see what happened. I don't know. Here, is something? Pause me? Oh, it's frozen. It's wanting everyone to take a deep breath with that vision, maybe. Okay, there we go. So these are just some of the activities that it was really helpful for us to look at what are we doing to get to this vision. And so we were able to break it into 4 groups of activities, facilitating partnerships, which includes convening anchors and community leaders, providing a governance structure, and really, you know, identifying and securing funding to help keep this going. Creating co-learning opportunities, so that's hosting learning sessions on topics related to health, wealth, and climate resilience, as well as keeping people posted, and helping anchors and communities to better understand each other, as well as sort of defining the values that bring us together. Mobilizing projects, so this is really the process of prioritizing and selecting projects that, based on the research, the assets and the capacities of the anchors and the communities, and selecting those projects, as well as providing pre-development support, so helping get them off the ground with the collective assets of the group. And then scaling the model, so we need to be able to document and evaluate these projects and see how they're getting to the outcomes in that grand vision. And as well as disseminating and telling the story so that people can understand how it happened and how we got there together. So while that was happening, we were sort of developing the logic model, we were also designing a participation and collaboration survey that was designed to really understand ARC participants' impressions of the quality of of participation and collaboration at the ARC table. So we sent out a survey to about 100 ARC stakeholders. Again, some of you filled it out. Thank you so much. We had 39 people respond. And then our consultants did follow-up semi-structured interviews to get to really more of the qualitative information. And the survey and the interviews focused on 6 domains of participation and collaboration, which were vision, engagement, leadership, decision-making, communication, progress, and outcomes. So this is who responded to the survey, and so you can see it was predominantly nonprofit community-based organizations, 38%, 15% anchor institutions, 13% foundation or investor, 10% other business, public agency, art convener. So we got mainly feedback from our nonprofit partners, which was really helpful because this is about, you know, the community-based, the engagement and participation is about really connecting with the community partners as well as the anchor partners. So we were happy that that was our top 2 responders. So what did we find? We found that there was a strong sense of commitment to and belief in ARC's overarching vision, so that was good to hear. We found that participants hold a mostly positive view of ARC staff and their skills, work ethic, and commitment to equity, but there was concern with inadequate staff capacity to do the work necessary to accomplish ARC's vision. Participants reporting higher level of involvement with ARC were more likely to agree with positive statements about ARC. Participants are ultimately hopeful about the potential impact of the ARC table in the communities of the East Bay. And participants have already experienced positive benefits of ARC participation via co-learning opportunities, new partnerships, and increased access to resources. So this was really helpful for us to hear as we were moving into phase 3, so how everyone was sort of experiencing the ARC table and what we were doing well and what was more challenging for our stakeholders. So moving into 2018, which we're already more than halfway through, we've been incorporating the recommendations in these different areas, and I'm going to pass it off to Tara in a minute to talk about the governance. But that was really something we heard, that the decision-making was unclear, and how are decisions being made at ARC. So we've been articulating the ARC governance structure so that we can increase participation and facilitate leadership, because if it's a murky system and you don't know how to get into it, we heard that it was hard to understand how people could have agency and participate in the process. Also the communications, we've been working on developing clear messages around the goals, objectives, and activities of ARC. The staff capacity, we heard that loud and clear, and we also feel that way, so we have been hiring additional staff to provide support, like having Caitlin come on to do the regional food system assessment and workforce opportunities, and we're also seeking a project coordinator. That the position is out there in the world. So, and yeah, so we're working on that. Community engagement, so all of the above pieces we found from the evaluation will help ARC to better engage, and that was, we also were planning for this event as well as the one in Richmond to really re-engage and hear from our stakeholders about how they want to move forward and get everyone excited to participate. So we're also doing continued evaluation. We'll be sending out the participation and collaboration survey again probably in the spring. And we also have internal evaluation going on, so we can just sort of keep ourselves in line. So that's all for the evaluation. I'm going to pass it over to Tara to talk about how we are, our governance structure.
So yeah, so for many of you who have participated, we've primarily had Healthcare Without Harm and ARC as the co-conveners, and then working with our executive committee. So that little executive spot, and that was called the advisory committee. And it was primarily the people who had the vision around ARC and the intention around procurement with anchors. And so that group of, 18 to 20 different people helped us with our our intentions, our missions, our outreach, our engagement, and supported us. But now that we're actually building the structure, we really need a much more robust and a governance that we actually understand. So this may not be understandable for you. There's more documentation. However, this was our visual because we think this is the best way to at least infer what we hope to accomplish in invitation of you to participate. So the big request for us and for those over the next 6 months is we want to really build a strong steering committee. And within that steering committee of 18 to 20 people, there's a defined executive committee, and then there's roles around the steering committee in terms of how you engage and why you engage. We really want somebody who's engaging who can stay for, 2 years, who are committed to be an ambassador for the project. So there's a criteria around your engagement. It's not just, oh, this sounds exciting, but you really have to participate to make it strong. And then within it, we have committees at the larger level, which is sort of the broader evaluation, communication, innovation and project defining, and looking at financing and working at, as I said, having that local financing partner in place and having a finance work group. And then as the projects get chosen, they will naturally bring up their own work groups because they'll have specific needs and criteria. So for the regional food system, there's clearly a supply value chain of farmers and aggregators. And then within workforce development, locally for those businesses, clearly it's a different set of stakeholders, and then financing within this. So our intent is by 2019 to have a strong steering committee ready to go to help us and to help define this, because we really do want this to be collaborative and integrated with the community and a variety of stakeholders. And we know, even just within our executive committee, there's such a wealth of intelligence and knowledge and expertise in the Bay Area that this success is completely tangible, but we just really want people to come who really believe in this objective. That's kind of just what we were saying. We want to build out the steering committee. We have some work groups in place, but we have to actually build them specific around priority areas like the food system. And to continue, and the work is to continue learning sessions, convene interested parties, gather input for the community and the anchors, look at the people who want to participate, and also look at projects and final selection criteria. So there's a lot of opportunity to define what this is going to look like. And that leads us to you guys, since this is our first part, some of the questions that you might have, because again, some of you have never participated, so there's probably some queries. And some of you have heard about specific things to the project, and we can do our best to answer them. So my request right now is somebody to press that button and make it green. And then that should pick up your questions. And you want to press that button for green?
Yep.
Okay.
I don't know if we do this, I'm going to give it, since you're here, I'm going to go ahead and give it to you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Nate Honda with East Oakland Building Healthy Communities. And my questions are, who were the original anchor organizations, especially those in East Oakland? How many of them are led by people of color? How many of them employ people of color? How many people of color are employed in those key anchor partners? And yeah, that's my questions.
So kind of a little too specific for our knowledge, because the anchors that we involved in the interviews were just a broad base of many anchors, so it wasn't like within the query of the surveys. But the people participating at this steering committee, the anchors have been like Kaiser, Dignity, UCSF. So I could find out that information, but I don't know it specifically.
Okay, thank you for that, Tara. What I'm really trying to get at is, we know what's happening in Oakland. I live in District 7 in Deep East Oakland, and I'm seeing gentrification every day. So after all this, we worry about this in all the work we do. When I was with Communities for a Better Environment, who are we cleaning up the environment for? Who's going to be here to enjoy the clean air and the access to the healthy food once we do all this work, because the demographics are changing. And so I'm just trying to see in the vision where the anti-displacement and the retaining of Black and brown folks are who are going to benefit from this, and where's the principles and the vision to try to ensure that by bringing them into these, I don't know how to articulate it, but into whoever's doing this work, who's ever anchoring this work.
I'm Nadine Wilmot. I'm with EOBHC's L&E, Learning and Evaluation team, and I just wanted to follow up on Nihanda's question about how is that kind of a central, like, equity and justice frame being built into the work at its core, and then also, again, like, for example, looking at your logic model and you see the 5 to 10 years and 10 to 20, and those intervals, this displacement that is happening is occurring so rapidly that who stands to benefit will be different in 5 years. So I think one of the pieces I was wondering about was a strong, coherent housing strategy, which would also involve connections with the city and the nonprofit housing groups.
So again, this is an invitation for you guys, because the steering committee is going to address the projects and then potentially address some of the queries that you have. Certainly right now, none of us on board know anything about housing, right? So the opportunity is really, I think what I'm inferring from yours is anchoring, who's anchoring the table. And that really is an invitation and a query for the folks here to invite people in who's going to speak to this, who have certain criteria, right? Like, they're going to be there for 2 years. They are going to be ambassadors for ARC. They're going to, understand the expertise that is needed to deliver on this. So this is really the opportunity to say, if you want a certain way for this to look or engage or be representative, please say, yes, I'm curious. I want to participate. Any other questions? Oh, okay. Yeah. I'm going to give this to you because we're recording, so this will make sure you get clearly heard.
Hi, I'm Sapna. I'm with University of California Office of the President. I know that UCOP was involved in some early discussions a few years ago, so my question now is, what are the specific ways to get involved beyond the learning sessions? What are the specific projects? I see this great vision, but I would love to know more about the tangible next steps that are going to get Oakland to that vision.
So again, just to clarify, it's not just Oakland, it's the East Bay, because we understand it's an ecosystem, and we have specific cities or areas that we want it to most benefit. So to your question, that is going to be the working groups. So the steering committee is an arching, kind of like the people who lead the vision. They meet 3 to 4 times a year, so they're the broad-based conveners conversation, and then it's the working groups that will actually specifically address conversations around financing, project choice, workforce development, and those will probably meet, again, this is going to be self-directed every 2 weeks on sometimes if a project is at a certain place. Those working groups are going to meet more regularly for, might be 6 weeks. Or 2 months to do something very specific because it's being asked of them, or it could be once a month that you set the tone. For example, when we did the evaluation, it was like, boom, we had to get it in place. We met every week to build it up for 2 months, and then now they're not meeting as often. So I think the working groups are the ones who are going to actually move.
Yeah, I just had a question about the steering committee in terms of, and I'm not sure if this has been settled yet, the steering committee itself might decide this, but what is the kind of the accountability measures in terms of how the steering committee is responsible to the working groups and then I guess the larger community as a whole?
Well, we have this beautiful matrix And the matrix has like a choice and a who makes the, a yes, and this is, again, we did this with a consultant, like, so we were anticipating a conversation and what would it look like if something came through and who would decide what. So we have a matrix of decision-making, but it's flexible.
Can I just add, I think that really the number one priority, and to your question, Sapna, is to get a broad representation of folks on that steering committee so that we can start really mapping out the decision-making process from the work groups. Right now, since the Regional Food System Project sort of presented itself a year and a half ago, we've been very focused on that. So the priorities are the steering committee as well as the working groups that have to do with the regional food system. I think the energy and the green enterprise, as projects come to the table and the steering committee decides that they want to work on those projects, then people can come forward and be part of those work groups too.
And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the work group, kind of suggested structure, folks who could participate as part of the regional food system presentation in a bit, but that will only cover, the working groups that are under that project. So, yeah, we're kind of building it out.
Yeah, so, and again, you can be on a steering committee, and then we hope you're on a working group, right, because it's the different engagements.
Yeah, so as someone not from the East Bay, as a partner from other parts of the Bay Area, what is the added value that we can bring to the table, given that it's still very focused on the East Bay? And what will be, how can I sell it to my institution and say, this is what we are going to gain from the participation in ARC at this point?
And I hate to make an answer because I actually, I think it's multi-dimensional. There's multiple ways that having other partners included, because the ecosystem is not in a city. Workforce is not in a city. Procurement, supply, demand is not in a city. So at this point, we're trying to address it because we have a specific area that we've been focused on. But when you talk to supply and demand, neither of those things are localized. Even though people might say, we want to hire from Richmond, people travel from Oakland to Richmond, or vice versa. Any other response to that?
I guess I would just add that, when you think about the regional food system, and Caitlin's going to go through this a lot, can I just yell? Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
When we think about the regional food system, it's definitely more than just the communities of East Oakland and Richmond. And what's been happening alongside the development of this ARC work is the aggregated volume demand among institutions all over the Bay Area, the healthcare, the universities, the K-12 school districts. So as ARC is being developed and we're looking at ways in which we can build capacity in East Oakland and Richmond, there's an effort going on, too, to aggregate institutions towards local and sustainable and really get commitments from those institutions to purchase local and sustainable. So there's a lot of place for involvement, I think, for institutions all around the Bay Area.
Great. And I will answer that as well. So, the power of this work for me, as I see it, Denise Fairchild, Emerald Cities National, is the market transformation side of it, right? And I say that in this way. Every sector of our economy, whether it's the energy sector or it's the housing sector or whether it's the food sector, is we don't control, we don't own, and has built inequities in the lives of low-income communities of color. And when you think about each of those sectors, they're regional. You talk about it as an ecosystem, so they're regional. So if we're going to restructure the food system, or we're going to restructure utility monopoly system and make it community-owned, community-controlled, then it is regional in terms of looking at the supply chain and who's supplying this and who owns it, who controls it, and how does it now look to benefit our communities. And I think, all of this is regional, and having anchors as partners in this market transformation gives it a power that we as community groups have always struggled with. We had a little bit of money from the foundation and a little bit of, rah-rah from government. But at the end of the day, it's the anchor resources redirected towards community needs that I think is innovative to help power community engagement. The only other thing I would say is that we do need to be more intentional about displacement and ensuring in the language of the theory of change in the steering committee and all those things that it is central. But I think what Tara and the team is saying is that this is the outreach to everyone to say, own this, okay? Bring your best ideas and theory and principles and values, because this is emergent. It's not baked in stone, and it is important for your voices and your body to be present in this enterprise.
Okay, we'll do one last question, then we'll move on.
All right. I think this is a follow-up to the conversation that we've just been having, and that is, as you build out the steering committee and work groups, are you looking to sort of get, I don't know what to say, sort of equal, more or less, representation around the Bay Area, or really still is the focus going to be more in Richmond and Oakland and the East Bay, or are you sort of really looking to broaden it out in this work? And I guess the same question, related question is, when do you expect to try to flesh this out to have the governance structure in place?
So we haven't, determined when. I think we hope in the next 6 months. So starting in 2019, probably February, we have a steering committee, a good size representation, and then working groups coming from that as well. So we've got about 5 or 6 months to get everyone on board. And then, again, I haven't asked the specific question, is that what do we think? But I think the steering committee is broader, because, again, it's we have UCSF on our steering committee because they're an important anchor, and they procure, and they're working on equity, and they're looking at housing. That's why I want San Mateo. So I think we definitely want a broader representation. And then as far as some of the community stakeholders, we want to make sure that East Oakland and Richmond is represented, since those are the 2 points we want to sort of deliver in. But, a farming aggregator might be a really good partner who comes from, Salinas, but, the South Bay. I think these are one of the questions that we're asking the steering committee to say, what do we need on this table to make it successful? Because we don't necessarily have the answers to that. We don't know. We're not in every place and know everything. So it really is a big open question and an engagement, and I think that's exciting because it's sort of how do you want to define this to make this work and deliver on it. All right, now we're going to go to the next part of our conversation. And again, inviting Caitlin Joseph, who has been super amazing at defining information that will be usable, we intend, for the working groups to look at these reports such that they can be acted on and delivered on.
All right. Oh, and just so you guys know, these are on, there's one of each of her reports, and we sent it via email. And so for those of you who can find out where we send it,
thanks everyone for being here. As Tara said, the reports, I'm going to talk through some of the findings of the reports. We also, I sent a link to the presentation, and there are active links in that to explore some of the resources that have been created out of this assessment work. So I just want to highlight before I begin kind of how, what my role has been in shaping the work and what you're going to hear today. So I have been consulting on behalf of ARC through Emerald Cities since about fall of last year. I'm actually going to be closing out my role soon, the next few weeks. So I'm really excited to be able to kind of share with you all in person and see your faces finally to let you know kind of what the progress has been on kind of building out from that big vision that ARC set out to do and finding this opportunity with FSP in Richmond, and then kind of zooming back out a little bit to find out how does that opportunity with FSP fit into a broader picture of what food system work could look like given ARC's goals of health, wealth, climate resiliency, and targeted communities in the East Bay. So
I'm not going to provide a lot of detail on the Richmond facility and FSP, except for the extent to which I've been working with Megan to kind of build capacity and do that kind of vendor outreach and that sort of thing. So I'm going to go into that a little bit, but in terms of updates on kind of where the status of that, this presentation isn't going to provide that at this point, but we're happy to answer those questions throughout the day in Q&A or in follow-up. So Lauren shared a bit about kind of the logic model of ARC broadly. And so one of the things I wanted to do in coming on was to kind of start to define how do those main outcomes that ARC is seeking, how do those operate in the Regional Food Systems Project? So how do we get from Regional Food Systems work doing food procurement and workforce development in food system to these different outcomes that ARC has set out for. So if you click the link later on, you can actually see the logic model in more detail. And this is just kind of a visualization that helps break it down a little bit. So you can kind of imagine going from this gray square, starting with kind of how ARC is convening to kind of build the institutional demand and kind of move through the institution's own processes in envisioning how things could be different, and then hopefully getting this as kind of a boost to the market, transforming what that procurement can look like, instilling it with the values that ARC wants to see, and then, moving into health, wealth, climate resilience. So obviously, all of us who are practitioners in the room know there's a lot of assumptions in between each of these pieces that we could unpack and tinker with to perfect. So part of this is an invitation to participate in that kind of development and making sure that the underlying logic of how this project functions fits with what all the participants and the stakeholders really want to see. So that logic model you can take a look at and would be probably a great tool to kind of see, because in there we've laid out what are some of the assumptions that are kind of underlying how you move from point A to point B. So feedback on that is super helpful. So here's just kind of an outline of some of the key actions taken this year as part of the Regional Food Systems Project. I'm going to go through each of these in a bit more detail, focusing mostly on the assessment outcomes, because I wanted to digest these giant reports for you a little bit. And then 3 and 4, I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of the behind-the-scenes relationship building and some of the resources that we've created to share with community stakeholders. So in terms of the assessment, I also wanted, before we move on, just to kind of highlight what we mean by value chain. So traditionally, when you think about kind of the supply chain, we're thinking about what comes from, how you get from the farm to the end consumer. In this case, the end consumer being the anchor institutions, the food service operations within anchors. So instead of talking about it as a traditional supply chain, which generally doesn't take into account kind of the negative externalities of kind of how our conventional system of supply chain works in the food system, including reduced soil health, reduced community sovereignty, lack of trust between the supply chain partners. We're adopting USDA's definition of value chain, which really incorporates all of the different players in a food system, including the nonprofit conveners, the technical assistance advisors, those intentional businesses like Mandela, like Planting Justice, like Dig Deep, who are trying to reframe how the food system functions and bring those values in that can actually deliver the health, wealth, climate resiliency outcomes that the food system can deliver if that value intention is brought in. So that is why we're trying to adopt value chain rather than supply chain. And then I'm going to talk about the workforce assessment as it pertains to the jobs that are relevant for the food system sectors that ARC is most poised to influence. So there's definitely other workforce issues that can be addressed and jobs obviously outside of the food system that can be assessed or looked at in future projects. So in terms of the assessments, these are some of the main questions that we were asking to kind of frame the research. So first is just what's needed to build a regional food system capable of meeting institutional demand. Again, with ARC's vision in mind, this question was asked with particular intentionality around how is that regional food system representing the fullness of diversity of California, of the East Bay. That is, we're bringing in historically underrepresented farmers to actually be able to supply institutional demand. So that question is being asked with ARC's particular nuance. And then the second question is around the workforce piece. So what's needed to improve living wage job opportunities in institutional food service and food processing sectors. Food processing, kind of using a shorthand for food processors and manufacturers, some of those businesses like food service partners that contract with institutions to provide meals. So these are the sectors we zeroed in on because we felt that ARC really had the most likelihood of influencing those sectors as opposed to jobs in restaurants or food retail, things like that. And then the third question is really how can ARC influence the development of those systems while holding on to its goals of health, wealth, climate resilience, particularly for marginalized communities in Oakland and Richmond. Okay, so each of the reports give you a little bit more depth on kind of what the approach was in terms of data scoping and analysis. Both assessments really had a similar kind of qualitative approach of literature review, stakeholder interviews, online scoping, which is just Googling, and assessment mapping, and kind of partner foraging. So that's sort of trying to understand, you know, who's out there that can be a part of this work. And then a little bit of secondary data analysis to kind of create some original analysis that's useful for us. So you can take a look at the reports to understand, you know, what literature was reviewed, where the citations are, and which stakeholders were represented through interviews. Okay. So now I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of highlighting some of the key findings in the value chain assessment in particular. So this is one of our asset maps that really tracks who a bunch of these players are that represent the value chain. So this is a Google map which you can click on the link in the presentation and really go through all these different players. So when you click on one, you'll see there's information about the farm, or so we've got farms, we've got distributors, both the local distributors and aggregators at food hubs, and then the more mainstream distributors like Cisco. And then we've got the anchor partners themselves and regional food system conveners who are poised to kind of help build the capacity of farmers. And then we've got, in yellow, there's some kitchen incubators here. So this is a map you can click through and add to also. We definitely know there's probably folks we're missing on here. So again, as all of this work, this is an evolving piece that we hope folks will participate in building out. So there's a couple of other maps that were built out of that initial Google map. This is just one that highlights kind of the situation around produce farms and distributors. So it expresses the darker circles are the GAP certified farms. So for folks who don't know what GAP certification is, it is just a food safety certification for farms that typically wholesale buyers or institutions will require of a farmer in order to get their food in. So this just represents kind of who are the low-hanging fruit, no pun intended, farmers who might be able to sell to institutions, and kind of how is their general scale situated in our area. So this circle is the 50-mile radius, and this is the 250-mile radius around us. So in terms of thinking about some of our anchor partners, Kaiser has defined local as that 250-mile radius. And our goal in moving the health, wealth, climate resiliency into the East Bay is to kind of move that purchasing in toward this 50-mile radius eventually. So this helps us understand, you know, how many
GAP-certified farms are there and what is their scale in that 50-mile radius. So you can see there's kind of smaller GAP-certified farms, but they're definitely there. We have them in this 50-mile radius. And then these lighter green farms are folks like Planting Justice, Dig Deep, Urban Tilth, those folks that are farming right here in the East Bay. Didn't focus on highlighting the urban farms in San Francisco because we really want to, if we're going to build capacity and bring in underrepresented farmers in institutional purchasing, we want to focus on those coming from the East Bay, so that's what's highlighted here. We can tell there's at least 63 acres worth of production that's happening in that hyper-local context by non-certified, non-GAP-certified farms. And then in the report, it also highlights some analysis done in 2010 around like land use. So you mentioned land use earlier as a question. There's I don't know if folks know Nate McClintock, did some work for the Oakland Food Policy Council back in the day on trying to figure out how much vacant land is available on both publicly owned land and privately owned land that is actually suitable for vegetable production. So that work really showcases that there's, I think it was more than 8,000 tons of vegetable production that could come out of that land, more than 4,000 of fruit production. Still only a fraction of what Oakland and Richmond actually consume in terms of those products, but it could make a dent in terms of institutional purchasing. Again, folks who know this work know there's a lot of challenges to get from point A to point B, but it just showcases some of that potential. And then the other dots here are the local and mainstream distributors that could be engaged in kind of helping connect the dots to get the food from the farms to institutions. I also want to highlight before moving on here that, you know, this work really only highlights produce, but we've also been working a lot with ProcureWorks, which is a project of Healthcare Without Harm, to figure out who are the potential vendors in dairy, in meat, in seafood, in grains. So we've got a bunch of vendor lists going, and ProcureWorks is going to be continuing that work to kind of look through those initial lists, call up each of those farms, figure out are they actually legitimate potential vendors for an institution. So trying to do that work for the institution of figuring out who is actually available for this purchasing. So part of the work we were, part of what we're trying to figure out is what do these different players need? So what are the gaps and which of them can ARC try to fill? So I didn't include here gaps that, that are kind of systemic barriers, right, that, for example, farmers facing, you know, not being able to access affordable land, or the land that they can access not being proximal to distribution networks. Those are not really things that ARC is super poised to influence, but one of them was for food hubs needing more clarity from FDA on how the food safety regulations fit for their particular operations. Again, not something ARC can influence, but these pieces are things that ARC is poised to influence through kind of the mechanisms that it has built out. So trying to figure out how to diversify the financing opportunities for farmers and food hubs that are looking to build additional equipment that they might need to scale up and serve these markets. More technical assistance. So part of what this project surfaced is who are the folks that are poised to provide that technical assistance, especially for underrepresented farmers who across the state is already, you know, working with those folks and can answer questions when needed. And then a lot of the relationship building between farmers, distributors, institutions, that is something that ARC can convene. And generally kind of more collaboration, more information sharing. These are pieces that everyone across the value chain needs and is something that ARC can influence. Just a couple of other opportunities, trying to keep it positive. There's definitely a whole section on challenges, which you can dig into, but I think folks who are engaged in this work probably can name 5 of them off the top of their head. This is one that was interesting. Just looking at, part of ProcureWorks' question was what data does USDA provide that can help us understand what opportunities there are for institutions to actually articulate which products they might want to prioritize for local purchasing. So this graph shows since USDA started collecting data from farmers on what produce never left their farm, this is the average that we can see from those just 2 years. Very interesting, so you can see this is in millions of dollars worth of produce that just never left the farms. Obviously biggest in cherries, bell peppers, strawberries. Avocados is actually kind of high, but tomatoes, huge, and folks who might have been paying attention to ag news in the last few years might know that Heinz and ConAgra closed a couple of processing plants in 2016. So hence, lots of tomatoes rotting in the field. So these are some dynamics that are at play, in the system that could be a huge challenge. Maybe some of those farmers have taken some of those fields out of production for tomatoes, switched to other crops, but it could also suggest that there's some farmers who are looking for a new market and might be willing to work with institutions on pricing. That might work better. I'm just going to check time. And then I mentioned Nate McClintock's analysis on, potentially expanding urban farming. Also, kind of improving the efficiency is another piece that represents an opportunity. Trying to figure out, how to get those tech folks involved. I don't know, maybe that's not a good answer. I have lots of questions about that myself. But there's definitely opportunities for figuring out how to make urban farming more efficient, and maybe even utilizing indoors. There's some roof farms that are covered as well in the report. Anyway, I'll leave this to you to kind of look in the report for deeper detail on these. Although I want to highlight one opportunity we've started some work on is exploring the creation of producer cooperatives. This can help small farms not only aggregate their products, but also obtain food safety certification in a collective manner. So we've been working with some community organizers to try to identify which farmers might be interested in that and who are the technical assistance providers in cooperative business that can help foster that development. Okay, so workforce. This is a whole other report, so we're shifting gears a little bit here. I just wanted to highlight kind of why we're interested in workforce in general. I think a lot of folks in the room already know we are facing a future in which middle wage jobs are being continually hollowed out. And we have seen that the food system is a huge opportunity for figuring out how we can lift those jobs up. The food system contains some of the lowest wage jobs across industries, and we'll go into a little more detail on that. But that's really our framing here. In terms of the institutions that we're interested in, again, the institutional food service piece is kind of thinking about who are the workers within Kaiser, within UC Berkeley, who are, creating the meals, or who are the contractors with those institutions, and what is the landscape like for those workers. Our findings tell a pretty compelling story around the opportunities to influence this system. We understand from a Bay Area food economy report from SAGE and American Farmland Trust that around the Bay Area, about 13% of the workforce is in the food economy, and that the wages in those jobs are 64% lower than in all other sectors. So a pretty huge difference. We also know that they've grown a lot more. I think it was between 1995 and 2015 that the rate of growth in jobs in the food system was double the rate of all other industries. So this is a growing issue. We also know from looking at Bureau of Labor Statistics data that a large portion of the East Bay's workforce is already in food sector jobs, and not only that, they're in frontline jobs, particularly in restaurants and bars. So 2/3 of them are working, in restaurants and some of the lowest wage jobs. That's what we mean by front lines, usually those folks who are kind of entry level, pretty low mobility jobs. Looking at just the breakdown of those frontline jobs in each of these different industries, we can see that wages are slightly higher in institutional food service and food processing and manufacturing. There's also a greater diversity of occupations in that industry than in restaurant food service and food retail. So one of the opportunities we were thinking, is how can we access the folks who are moving into these industries and try to spread awareness of the opportunities in food service and manufacturing. We've heard from our partners in the area that are in food processing manufacturing that and in institutions, they're strapped for hiring enough reliable workers. So, and retaining them too, not just getting them in the door, but also keeping them on the job. So a couple of opportunities arise, just kind of spreading awareness of what the career opportunities are, documenting what the career ladders look like in institutional food service and food processing. And then for employers, helping them understand what are the opportunities for training your workers on the job, not only to retain them, but also to help them advance within the company. Training programs, both for workers and for employees, so especially for employers, again, helping workers advance, and then also tools and trainings on how to develop their businesses into more democratic workplaces, how to create kind of different cooperative business structures. One huge piece, to kind of get more cross-sector collaboration is transportation. Really came up as an issue. Workers just not being able to get to processing jobs. Obviously, wages, benefits, ownership opportunities need some working on. So I won't go into detail here, but the reports really highlight and synthesize what does this mean for what ARC can do. So this will be a little enticement for you to actually dig into those reports. You have to read them to know. Okay, so the next two slides, I just want to highlight a bit more of kind of the behind-the-scenes work. So when we talk about capacity building, generally we're building relationships, we're sharing tools, we're sharing knowledge. So this is what we've done on the anchor institution piece. So really trying to develop different procurement policies and processes for institutions that are interested in purchasing local, so kind of helping them get a start on what does it mean to start to have a conversation with a farmer if I want to purchase direct. How do I have that conversation? What questions are they going to ask? So kind of pulling together those best practices for folks. Again, designing relationship building opportunities. So we co-coordinated with CAF, the Community Alliance of Family Farmers, to host a good food showcase to bring buyers, aggregators, farmers together. And then we've been identifying potential vendors. You can take a look at that list. Fostering collaboration across different sectors. So this really has to do with, again, the work of ProcureWorks and all the other folks looking at farm to institution in the region. One of the things that I've been highlighting as I participate in those groups is that ARC brings a specific added value of having the equity lens of trying to highlight specifically where are the underrepresented farmers and where are the technical assistance providers that are poised to help those folks get integrated into the market. So, you know, we're not necessarily the only ones thinking about that by any means, but trying to provide some more structure around that is one of the things we bring. And then kind of looking at how are we working on the supply side. We've been facilitating relationships, especially with between Mandela and FSP. We've been kind of facilitating some different conversations around what, you know, as a food hub, what's needed to expand that technical assistance that Mandela provides to farmers. You know, how could a food service company like FSP actually help build that capacity? You know, just kind of generating conversation right now still, but we've provided some kind of templates on what could a more structured agreement look like in the future, and I think this can serve as a model for, you know, building that kind of model, replicating it with different food hubs around the area if that opportunity presents itself. And then, again, shared some different resources with folks who provide technical assistance to farmers. So here's a couple of, this is a presentation I shared with Mariella at Mandela to provide farmers if they're interested. Again, just like links on who do I talk to if I have a question about food safety, and then some more technical assistance advising. So folks are asking about next steps, what are the concrete things to engage in. Here's just a breakdown of kind of what a vision for the working groups within the food system work could look like. So here's some folks that we could really see as being important partners on these working groups in terms of the structure of what it will look like, you know, who you're going to receive an email from. I can't answer that question, but you know, here's just kind of a breakdown of an initial idea for who we really think could be important to have at the table for those groups. So if you see yourself represented, give us a chat at the end or let us know if you're interested or if you have thoughts. Okay. Happy to take some questions. Yes.
Just make sure everything's on green.
Actually, to Nahanda's important point earlier around anti-displacement, and to your slides around how food system jobs are low-wage jobs and mostly done by people of color, immigrants, and women. I'm wondering what kind of advocacy role ARC can play, or people who work at universities and hospitals in here to advocate that those anchor institutions pay a higher price to farmers, especially farmers who are meeting maybe some equity indicators, because that race to the bottom is happening when school districts pay $2 a meal and things like that. Folks who want to pay living wage jobs to farmers or businesses who are trying to make it can't compete in that system.
Yeah.
And then I have another question around land as well. Like you highlighted that there's, you know, maybe more than 1,000 acres of land in the East Bay owned by the City of Oakland, Oakland Parks and Rec, East Bay Regional Parks. I'm wondering what kind of role ARC might be able to play to work with those institutions to try to make land available to longtime Oakland residents, people of color, to be able to access that land, to be able to participate in this system.
Okay, so first question was around pricing, procurement, encouraging, advocacy around fair pricing for farmers. So I think one of the ways that, you know, the report at least highlights some of what can be done around that is best practices for kind of managing the added cost that is sometimes involved when local purchasing happens. Local food is not always more expensive for institutions, but it is sometimes, and the report goes into more detail about why, but also highlights some strategies that institutions have used in the past to kind of reduce waste on the plate. Kind of, you know, Healthcare Without Harm has had a campaign called Less Meat, Better Meat to kind of take some of the more expensive parts of the meal and reduce the cost by actually reducing the amount of meat, which obviously has added benefits, and can then allow a little bit more wiggle room on pricing for produce and other aspects of the meal. I think collaboration with folks like the Center for Good Food Purchasing on kind of, helping them access their research on, what does labor look like in the food system as well, and kind of, just sort of collaborating across different anchors to say, here's an anchor that's doing this great work. And I think part of ARC's role in advocating can just be to kind of highlight the good players and kind of encourage folks along. I don't know if other ARC folks want to answer how that advocacy might happen in the future too.
Well, I could say, I think that from a market transformation standpoint, there's best practices, but there's also policy. So it's the social capital, political capital, the financial capital that really needs to move in concert. And so that's why a collaborative table is important. So there are some folks in communities that are really strong on policy that should inform ARC about, this is, if we push this policy, we can move the needle. We can move the needle around employment. We can move the needle around local procurement. So policy should be a part of this, and finding the stakeholders to be at the table who are the strong advocates are, I think, an important strategy.
Yeah. I wanted to answer the second question before moving on, around land and kind of what would ARC's role be in encouraging institutions to kind of look for land opportunities. I think it's an open question. I think it depends on, which folks come to the table and what expertise they have. I think there's a ton of room for looking at, how anchors themselves are utilizing their land, and are there ways that they can actually, find plots that are suitable for cultivation. I think there's some complexities around then does that displace a market from a commercial farmer that, is poised to, has done all this work around food safety certification, and if they're growing it on site, and just getting it straight in, I don't know. There's many questions there, but I think it depends on kind of who comes to the table and might be able to offer expertise on, how to identify that vacant land and, go through the permitting process. I think there's a lot of different pieces there. I don't know if anyone else has.
I don't know if I want to ask questions anymore, but it's a thought, because I just want to know if we're thinking about it. The sectors that came up in the report or in the research were healthy food, and so this was about the food, and then clean energy, green building, construction, and then green enterprise, zero waste. So, and then connected to Gavin's point about land, we all know that there's another green business that's flourishing in Oakland, the cannabis industry. It's taking up a lot of this land. I don't know how much of it is left from that report that you mentioned was done like in the 90s or something. And so I know, again, in East Oakland, where I live, the community is concerned about just seeing, these cannabis industries popping up, taking up land, taking up property, taking up space. And so it's not, how are we thinking about this industry with regard to these sectors that have been identified and the competition or the possibility of connecting it to this work? So it's just a thought. I don't know if it's a question, but it's a thought that people are thinking about, concerned about, wondering, are there other opportunities or challenges?
Yeah, I just was...
To an earlier question, I don't know if, again, it's just a reflection that I had. In one of the presentations, we saw where costs go in buying food and where money gets pulled away. And I think one of the queries we have around that cost chain is if ARC is able to support a local space, and then it's not, so money isn't then going to these larger aggregators or intermediaries? Is there money saved that can then be brought back into purchasing locally, because so many of the contracts are held by big, you know, like Sodexo or something. So I think these are the queries that can be, like, what's the analysis, what's the strategy, and then how can we work with an anchor to maybe target 2 or 3 products they need to see what that practice looks like to bring money back into the purchasing. So I think this is why it's really involves everyone collectively, because there's so many parts to the equation and everyone has to sort of start to look at it holistically. Cannabis one, I think, again, it's a query that has to be brought in because, you know, we imagine there's local food being grown and then also in warehouses, right? Because you can target certain foods for warehouses, but so can cannabis be brought in warehouses. So we really do have a challenge with that. Any other questions?
I just want to say I really enjoyed reading the value capture assessment, so thank you for that. It was super helpful. And I have a little bit of an ARC systems question where, you know, my work at the city is trying to support our existing businesses, but I also appreciate the ARC vision around creating co-ops. And so when you've done this great value chain assessment and identified these opportunities, is there space in ARC to both support our local great farms that are here, and also at the same time you're trying to identify land for new farms? I mean, can you speak to that a little bit? Thank you.
I mean, I think the land for new farms is, I think there's less emphasis placed on that. I think it's actually more on what are the existing businesses that we can help build capacity for to get into institutional markets. Yeah, I think those maps, for example, you know, highlight the kitchen incubators that exist in the East Bay, because we see that as an opportunity for, you know, partnering with those folks to identify, are there businesses that are coming out of those incubators that you know, process tomatoes into ketchup that institutions might want to, you know, to procure, or, you know, do those represent opportunities for FSP to, you know, co-manufacture products for those folks, either for, or, you know, maybe not FSP, but for broader, you know, players, just kind of highlighting, you know, who to talk to if you want to find a local business whose food you can bring into the market. So I think the emphasis is more on existing businesses and farms.
Okay, so it's sort of both, because you're also kind of creating these co-op, you know, businesses that fit in the supply chain, right, like the distribution and processing centers. But just one follow-up on the incubator, I think that's really interesting, because we are having like a little boom in Oakland of shared food incubators. And I feel like most of the businesses are thinking more about retail and not necessarily thinking about wholesale to institutions. So it would be great to talk more about that.
Yeah, it sounds like that's an opportunity.
Yeah, something about procure work. So along those lines, in mid-October, we're hoping to convene a group of institutional food service directors from healthcare, K through 12, and the university sectors to really get them to hopefully hone in on a short list of like 3 to 5 priority products that they would all be interested in and perhaps willing to commit to purchasing locally, because it's all over the place. You know, I mean, the amount of food products that these institutions are buying is immense, but if we can prioritize the institutions together on a pesto, homemade soups, I mean, whatever that might be, whatever they're interested in, if we have a short list to work with, then I think we can really start addressing how that might get manufactured, how that might get processed.
And it helps build the infrastructure of connected issues.
I just wanted to answer another part about that question around the cooperative business piece. I think part of the inquiry that we've been exploring is not necessarily how to start brand new co-ops, but how to take existing businesses and help them incorporate cooperative principles. So, you know, or even transition over time to employee ownership like an ESOP. So that has been more the discussion that we've been having.
I want to try the procurement question again, maybe ask it more specifically. If local food procurement is great, but if we're paying small farmers the same price for a pound of lettuce that we're buying through Sodexo, that small farm's probably not going to be able to survive or pay its workers a fair wage. So I'm wondering, is there any precedence or willingness amongst anchor institutions to do different tiered pricing? So maybe you buy through Sodexo for whatever you buy through Sodexo, but if there's equity indicators being met by local producers, is there any precedence for that amongst universities, school districts, hospitals?
I might, point to any anchors in the room that know of examples of that? Or?
I don't know of an example, but what we know is that the incentive is there that also can account for community benefits. So many of these institutions have to, because to have the nonprofit status, they have to prove some sort of community benefits. So there might be ways to explore there as far as like how to create incentives for these institutions to pay a little bit of a higher price that provide, you know, additional equity indicators.
And I do know one example through the Farm Fresh Healthcare Project, which is coordinated through PATH and ProcureWorks Healthcare Without Harm. There is an example about organic strawberries that I think it's up to now 7 institutions that are part of what's called the Bay Area Leadership Team have aggregated their volume demand around organic strawberries because of the concern of labor practices, but also pesticides on conventionally grown strawberries. And they are paying a higher price, but they also aggregated a huge volume, so the price didn't go up as much as it might have if it were one institution. So they work with Coke Farms. You're probably familiar with them as an aggregator in the Central Coast. So there are examples of ways in which institutions can aggregate their volume demand, and that commitment to purchasing from small-scale producers can keep the price point within their capacity.
Yeah, I'm with Kaiser Permanente, the Director of National Nutrition Services, and seafood, you know, I live it, breathe it every single day. But, you know, what we're seeing, too, is just by decreasing the carbon footprint, you know, that you're getting the price breaks in that capacity. And the other side note from it is, like, we've been doing this for 15 years to, you know, really figure it out and really move the needle on it. And, you know, we do have commitments, you know, surrounding all this. But one of the early on aha moments at Kaiser Permanente was we started with just 5 items because we didn't know where to start. So we started with just the 5. And when we made the commitment, you know, to use these 5 items, I was actually working at the Oakland Medical Center at the time and doing rounding with my patients, and my patients were saying, gee, my cherry tomato tastes really good. The cherry tomato was vine ripe, and it was a garnish. That's the first time in my career, I've been in the business 40 years, it's the first time in my career that I've ever had anyone say to me, gee, I loved your cherry tomato. And then it was the fruits, you know, and the local vegetables. So that's what we're seeing is we're decreasing the carbon footprint, and even though we may be paying a little bit more than quote unquote conventional, to us it's worth it. We're getting that taste profile. And when you have fruits and vegetables that taste good, people want to eat them. If they're being grown clear across the country and shipped in and they don't taste good, they're not going to eat it, and they'll never have the health benefit from it. Does that help answer some of your questions?
Yeah. There's kind of one other piece of that, too, that I wanted to highlight, that Baylin's comment around community benefit reminded me that, you know, I think part of what ARC is trying to explore is, you know, how can anchors actually participate in sort of subsidizing some of those farms by way of supporting, their capacity growth. So, if it's a farm that doesn't have food safety certification, is there a way that community benefit investments from nonprofit hospitals or, any other investments that other anchors make, is there a way that can support farmers in building their ability to sell? So, it's not necessarily working with them on the pricing of the final product, but working at kind of the input level of their costs, their input costs, or reducing that. So just kind of trying to figure out like a holistic way of working with that system.
Just a comment, the cannabis industry, actually there's a lot of regulations around the equity permits here in the city of Oakland that actually include community benefit as well. So I think that actually using some weight as a coalition to talk about making folks' social impact statement look good by helping subsidize, whether it's the wages for the workers or the prices for the products, I think that could be really helpful. So I think that's something that folks often forget, is that when we talk about equity and we have all these permits and we have this big flourishing industry of marijuana, which I'm not against, but then we also have starving children, elders, and folks of all ages in the same community. I think we can push a harder line on really looking at what is the community benefit, because they've all had to agree to having them, but they're waiting, they're going to be directed. They're not going to go out of their way to do it first. So yeah, that's important. I think it's really important to use there's a lot of really good thinking here, but I think that direct advocacy could be helpful.
Well, okay, actually I will just chime in as a representative of Kaiser's Community Benefit. I hear what you guys are saying, and I'm inclined to agree with Caitlin that at least the way we've approached this historically is the community benefit dollars or resources that we have been used to provide support for infrastructure and capacity building. I think the other community benefit is of a different sort and related to the cannabis industry. I know it certainly doesn't relate to...
So community benefit is something that's used for a lot of development. So I don't mean directly about Kaiser. Right. I'm talking about business in the city of Oakland, community benefit agreements for local hire, all different
Definitely, yeah. You're absolutely right. So there is, in that way, there is a difference in sort of the guiding requirements around hospitals, not-for-profit community benefit requirements. So, because I think it would be really problematic if we were to use community benefit resources to subsidize the cost of a business expense, which then goes back to serve our own patients. I'm sitting here thinking, what's problematic about that? Because it feels, anyway, but I think the other point is really well taken about how we can use it to provide support to a lot of the different elements that were articulated in these reports. I also think about the efficiencies and the opportunity for people to use technology to know what industries would like to have in terms of, a whole lot of cherry tomatoes, obviously tomatoes being an issue, by way of example.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly draw a distinction between the two types of community benefit being discussed. I think the one that Jean is alluding to is in the report there's kind of a breakdown of what does community benefit programming look like in nonprofit hospitals, and kind of what are the particular stipulations on how that functions. But then I also hear you talking about the community benefit agreements that happen between, advocacy organizations and communities, and whatever development projects are coming into those communities to kind of negotiate, how is this new business going to be, impacting the community. I think by the same name, but they're slightly different, or very specifically different programs or functions, but kind of similar concept. But yeah, also a really important piece.
So I was on an airplane recently and met some young white farmers who were leaving California looking for farmland back east because of the aquifers that are drying up and the challenges of climate change. In your study, or in your research, are there particular strategies we should be looking at in terms of the whole agricultural sector being threatened right now? about using smart water saving technologies and other new technologies in urban centers that's going to address sort of the climate impact on agriculture, which would then increase the cost of food and access to good quality food?
I think this particular assessment didn't go into depth in looking at those, but Healthcare Without Harm has been doing a lot of analysis on climate-smart agriculture and what does that look like, what does that mean. So we definitely have resources to share on those topics and trying to understand, you know, what are the opportunities for water saving through the mechanism of ARC's, you know, kind of procurement activity. So, you know, there might be a role to play in terms of kind of helping the advocacy organizations like CAF has and CalCan are doing a lot of work with producers across California to understand, you know, how to implement climate smart practices, including, you know, water savings. But you know, it's a whole complex thing that I think ARC is not necessarily, you know, aiming to influence in terms of the you know, helping farmers implement new practices, but it might be by way of incentivizing, you know, buying from farmers who are implementing those practices. So I think it's an evolving thing in that we're not necessarily trying to, you know, change farmers' practices directly, but kind of indirectly through the procurement mechanism. Does that answer? Okay.
Any other questions?
Thank you, everyone. You guys are so much smarter than some of us, so it's really important for you to... you guys really, what you're asking are the questions that need to be asked, that, you know, when we're holding the table, we only can focus on certain things, and so this is why it's so important to have a larger committee to address these questions. And also, I just wanted to reference again that the regional food system project came up because of the total health policy at Kaiser, which was driving it, because it was something they immediately were in query about, is how to localize the food. And ARC is also looking at other projects. So it's the food system project is a key one that's being motivated now, and anchors are looking at other innovations that need to happen, whether or not that's clean energy, laundry. So it's, the query is both come on board for these immediate work groups and the steering committee conversation around displacement and how does that impact new businesses and that kind of thing. So according to our agenda, we're past our break. So we actually wanted to, I'm going to invite Lauren, did you actually put this up, yeah, but I mean, are we set for the video thing? We are, okay. Okay, cool. So we're just going to take like a 10-minute break, go to the restroom, glass of water. We're going to set up a video in our next activity. So again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Hi. You're working very valuable. Yeah. Yeah, I had the convention managers and the okay, so they all need me I know that.